All right, we want to say welcome and good afternoon. Thank you for being here at Empowering Pastors Leadership Training. And as you can see, I'm not Pastor Spencer. He's out of town and has given me the opportunity to share an hour with you and bring some training to you. So I want to say thank you to Pastor Spencer for doing that. My name is Susan Bull. I am the director of the children's ministries here at His Tabernacle. This month makes 1 year anniversary for me. So I've been on the team for a year. To being in that position, I was the executive director of a nonprofit childcare organization in Corning. I was there for about 5 years. And before that, I was with a community action agency. We worked with family daycare programs within 3 counties of New York State. And I handled all of the grants managements through New York State and did all the supervisory stuff to coach and train and have everybody familiar with what they needed to do for their position. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, my husband, Rick, and my children, Nicole, his 2 kids, and I have a little one, Jack. So we are all here in this house at His Tabernacle. We're here every Sunday. I'm also a veteran. I had 5 years in the military after high school. So I've had a lot of different opportunities and plenty of experience with being supervised and supervising others and growing into leadership. And what I wanted to talk to you today about kind of extends about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, Dean Condon talked to us about crucial conversations. I don't know if the students, were you here? That might have been before you came back. Crucial conversations is an excellent learning tool. If you don't have this in your leadership toolbox, I would certainly suggest it. So we're going to talk about after you've had those conversations and you've gotten skilled in how to talk to people and managing your emotions, what happens when people break their promises? What happens when people behave badly? What happens when a deadline was missed? So that goes into crucial accountability. These obviously work together. But this is a really good thing because if you get experienced with crucial conversations, you might come to a point where you feel like, oh, we had this great conversation and we had this wonderful moment that we understand each other. But if you did not set a plan in place of who's doing what next, everybody walks away, something falls through the cracks. And then as the leader, the supervisor, you're thinking, wait a minute, what happened to that lovely moment where the heavens opened and angels sing? You know, we heard everything was wonderful. But if you don't take the steps of keeping people accountable, then the whole team will start to suffer. And really what that translates to is lost productivity, lost revenue. It just has not a very good end result. So in your handout, does everyone have notes? In your handout, we'll review very briefly crucial conversations, your first fill-in. That's a tool that's dealing with high-stake interactions where strong emotions and different opinions are given. So your fill-ins there are emotions and opinions. So what you want to remember about the word crucial, anytime you're in a crucial conversation, this is not about who's going to change the water cooler. This is about something where emotions are high and opinions vary. That's the combination for that to happen. So then the authors of this book wanted to take that into the next step, like we said, bring that sequel. What happens when people fail to do what they said they were going to do? So they opened their book with a really interesting research study. And this was maybe 3 decades ago. And they've worked on it all of these years. And they wanted to know what people do when people behave badly. So they took something relatively simple. They went out to the mall and they asked hundreds of people, what would you do if somebody cut in line in front of you? Would you say something? Every single person they talked to said, yes, of course I would say something. Then they took actors, they went to a movie theater within that mall, and they asked the actors to step in and cut in line. And strangely enough, not one person said anything. So all of the people that said, yes, I would absolutely say something, they decided they were going to stay silent. So this research team was like, why is that happening? How come people won't say anything? So they decided, all right, what happens if we put someone in that line and we give them a dialogue? So we're going to have someone say something to the line cutter. Maybe that will sort of act as a template to encourage others. So they put someone in the line. Here comes the line cutter. And somebody says, hey, get to the end of the line, like really crabby about it. And the guy was like, oops, sorry, went to the end of the line. And they thought, good, now somebody has a script. There's a mental script. They kept sending in line cutters. Nobody said anything. So the research team went and said, you saw when that guy said that, the person actually went to the end of the line. So how come you weren't prompted to then say anything when it happened again? And they said, well, we didn't want to be that jerk. That guy was really kind of not nice about it, and we didn't want to do that. So we chose to stay silent. So they thought, okay, that's interesting. So we offered a script, but it wasn't a script that made good sense in the mental math of what they needed to do. So then they went back and said, well, if maybe if we put somebody in there with a different script, people would be so inclined to say something. So they sent somebody in. Here come the line cutters. And the person said to them, excuse me, I think you were probably unaware, but we've been in line for 30 minutes. The end is back there. And the person, oh, I'm sorry. And they went to the end of the line. So interestingly enough, that dialogue that was not offensive encouraged people then to say the same thing. But they didn't just say something to the person. They used the exact same language. Oh, excuse me, I think you're unaware. We've been here for 30 minutes. So that fed some pretty interesting research for this team to then say, if people are silent because they don't like the mental math of what's going to happen if I say something, and you add that they don't want to say something that's going to be hurtful or offensive or make them look like the bad guy, they're just going to stay silent. They need a script that's going to work, that's going to be kind but effective. So in their studies, this team found that 93%, that's your next fill-in, of employees in the workplace have at least someone they find difficult to work with, but nobody says anything. Nobody's willing to address the behavior because they don't want to look like that jerk from the mall that said, hey, get in the end of the line. So nobody holds them accountable. It seems as though with a research project of you cut me off in line at the movie theater, that would be something that's not a big deal. One of the things that's critical about that study is that they took it into the workplace and realized that it might impact hospital protocol. It may impact safety in manufacturing. So they actually discovered that in 1986, most of you probably don't remember this, but you learned about it when the Challenger exploded. There was a teacher on that team and the world was so excited. A teacher's going to space. Up goes the Challenger, it explodes. Just horrific to watch. Come to find out, there was several of the engineers at NASA were concerned about an O-ring. I don't know what an O-ring is, but apparently it has something to do with making sure that wouldn't have happened. So that was kind of astounding to think, people aren't just quiet at the mall. They're quiet in the workplace, which is really frightening. So that motivated them more to come up with some dialogue and make sure people had some words to hold people accountable. So down at the bottom, for your next fill-in, findings also show that when leaders were asked who their top workers were, every single one of the top value employees selected by them had the skills to hold others accountable, that you fill in, and did so in the workplace. So it's not just an issue of being kind. It's not just an issue of safety. Those that really know how to hold others accountable, they're at the top level of performance according to their peers and their bosses. So we had to develop a script. And in this book, they break this book down into what are you going to do before, during, and after an accountability conversation? Because everything stems on this conversation that you have to maintain that accountability. So go to part 1. Anything that we want to do to motivate others to change, we have to start with ourselves. With this accountability conversation, it's no different. You have to look to yourself first, because we know, and what we learned with crucial conversations, if you go into any conversation emotionally charged, it's not going to be successful. So the step 1 before the accountability conversation really helps you get grounded and know what it is that you're after. So if we go down to 1, you want to choose the what and the if. What is the conversation that I should hold? And if I should hold it at all. So we know that a lot of times when we run into trouble, and if you've been in a relationship or in the workplace for any amount of time, you might be feeling like this thing is bothering me. But when you try to go and address that thing, there's 50 other things that spring up. So the what and the if really helps you identify what is the one thing I have to address, because if I address something else, I'm not going to be successful. So under the what, time constraints and hyped up emotions are often the cause of people confronting the wrong issue. And that's just it's something that comes over time. You learn how to identify that right issue. So to help you get to what do I need to identify, they give us the acronym of CPR. You want to look at the content, the patterns, and relationships. So if you're going to talk about a violation that just happened, that would be your content. So if work time starts at 9 and Jamie comes in at 9:30, the boss can go and say, Jamie, I noticed you got here at 9:30 instead of 9. What happened this morning? There's your content. Let's say that happens 2 more times, and then the following week, Jamie's in at 9:20. The boss will go, Jamie, I see that you're here at 9:20. This is the 3rd time I've had to address it with you. What happened today? You know, so you're still trying to figure out what's going on. Then let's say Jamie backs it up and maybe gets there at 9:10 for the 3rd week. Then you have to go and say, Jamie, I see it's 10 after 9. You're late. I talked to you about this 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure what's going on, but now your tardiness is starting to impact my ability to trust that you can be here on time. It's starting to impact the morale of the other people who are here on time. So that you have that pattern, but you connect that to how it's impacting the relationship. So you really have to figure out, what do I want, and if this is worth bringing up. Now, if you have to hold someone accountable to being to work on time, it's going to be worth bringing up. But if you have 50 other things going on with that person, then you might have to decide, if I bring this up right now, how is that going to impact the other 49 things that I have to do with this person? So you might need to do a little bit of mental planning to figure out how to do this, but you don't have the option of not holding that person accountable. You just have to kind of do that puzzle of, what are we going after here first? So when we go down to the if, and we talk about if, it can be easy to decide on having an accountability conversation when there's a clear broken promise. However, when the infractions are ambiguous or discussing them could get you into trouble, the key to deciding if you should speak up is honestly ask yourself, if you're not speaking up when you should, and ask yourself, am I leaking in my behavior? What does that mean? Leaking in your behavior can be sarcasm. It can be, the book uses the example of a mother and her 29-year-old son are having dinner together. The 29-year-old son lives at home and he's chronically unemployed. So has lasagna on her mouth. The son says, Mom, you have a little chunk of lasagna here. And she says, oh yeah? When I was 29, I had 2 jobs. That's leaking. So she is really frustrated with, like, I don't care what's going on with me. This is about what you're not doing. So an accountability conversation needs to happen, but it's not happened. But think about that in your relationships. Think about that in your workplace, because we have accepted sarcasm as humor. When we make other people laugh, we think that we're being accepted. We think it's funny. We think, oh, look what I bring, humor to the team. But if your humor is rooted in sarcasm around issues that you've not addressed that need to be addressed, then it becomes unhealthy. That is no longer funny, but it can get really yucky. So you want to think about, am I doing any of these things? So the bottom line with the if is, look at the risk involved. Do I need to have a conversation that I'm not having? Or am I not having one that I should have had? So the second part to getting yourself ready before you go into this conversation, you really need to be well informed. You need to look at, all right, I know what, I know if, then you have to decide to have the accountability conversation, master your story, which is your next fill-in, by seeking out all of the whys of the problem. Why is this going on with this person? Why is this repeated behavior? Why have I allowed this to happen? You're going to have to consider that as a question too. This helps bring balance, rational and empathetic view to the table. So if you are going in all charged up with this person, again, you've set the stage kind of for failure and disaster. You need to get yourself balanced of, why would this happen? Put yourself in the third person's shoes and ask, what would he do if he had seen the situation? The potential root of all behavior can be classified into a model that contains 6 sources of influence. So in your chart, you'll see this chart of motivation and ability. Is this person motivated to do what they have to do? Number 2, can they do it? So like the son, 29-year-old son who is chronically unemployed, I don't know, is it because he'd rather stay home and play video games, or does he not have the skill set for his desired job? I don't know. That's something that him and his mother, when they have their accountability conversation, need to figure out. You want to look at peer pressure. So for people who were, let's go back to the Challenger. If that launch date was set and it was non-negotiable and these engineers were concerned about some of the equipment, they might have been pressured into, we're not looking at that concern because we have to make this happen, which is horrific and heinous, but that's what's happening when people are being influenced by others. You need to look at ability, help from others. Somebody might be new in their job, or maybe they're not new in their job, but the task is so huge, they need help from others, and they haven't said that because they might think, oh, I'm going to look like I don't know my job if I have to ask for help. It's communicating, making sure everybody knows what's going on. You need to look at the carrots and sticks. Are people motivated by their paycheck? Are they motivated because they know that they bring value to the team? What's motivating a certain individual to do what it is that they need to do? And then you want to look at the structures, environments, and tools. So if, let's say in childcare, I expect everyone to clean up all the equipment after every shift has ended. They might want to comply with that, but if I didn't provide all of the cleaning supplies and then I try to hold them accountable, that's an issue with, well, they didn't have what they needed in the environment. They're motivated, they had the ability, but the tools were missing. So for our next fill-ins, at the top of the model, the 2 components in the behavior selection, in order to take the required action, the person must be willing and able. So that's something you need to consider before sitting down and having this conversation. If you know there's a capacity issue with someone that you're expecting them to perform at a level that maybe, let's say they need a teacher certification and they've only graduated high school, that's a mismatch. You can't ask them to do something where they need this skill set and they're not there yet. It has nothing to do with their motivation. If you notice that someone is struggling with motivation, which again, that's a little sometimes hard to detect, then you need to think about that. So you might not even know that information until you have your conversation, but you know that you have to consider those things. So we go down through this paragraph. I'm going to give you your next fill-ins. Back up to that sentence. Before lashing out at a subordinate who did not submit, this is an example. Before you would lash out at a subordinate who did not submit an urgent report as promised, you may discover that the other data analysis who held the critical information your subordinate needed for that report was on leave. Therefore, the infraction was one of inability. It wasn't even that person's inability, but if there's a missing link somewhere, to complete the task rather than a lack of motivation. So you just have to watch people. You have to study people. You have to know who your people are. The bottom line with this getting prepared, instead of assuming the worst about a person, then acting in a way that confirms your story, ask, why would a reasonable person not do what he or she promised? What role might I have played? When you see a person as a human rather than a villain, you're ready to begin the conversation. The mental stories that we tell ourselves, for some reason, seem to go into this loop of negative. Let's say you're on the highway, somebody passes you really fast. Oh my gosh, that guy was going so fast, I can't believe it. Then you get behind somebody else who's going so slow. Like when we get interrupted in what we're doing and somebody messes up our flow or we feel like we're unsafe, nobody can do anything right. So this is the problem when you're framing yourself for an accountability conversation. You have to step out of that. You cannot let your mental story go there, because then you're already coming in with a power over for that person. And it's not an effective way to have that conversation. So you're prepped, you're ready. You know what you're talking about. You know that it's worth having the discussion, and you've told yourself a positive story. Why would this reasonable person who I hired, why would they not do what they said they were going to do? You have to go into it that way, get more information. So in part 2, when you're during your accountability discussion, instead of calling out those serious consequential deviations of behavior as infractions, because that's kind of a threatening term, the authors are going to suggest that you use a term called the gap. So what you do for the gap, you describe the gap that you fill in of what you expected as well as what was actually observed. So you go back to the being on time thing. It says you work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. I expect you to be here at 9. I observed you here at 9:40 and then 9:20 and then 9:10. So you have objective, factual information to share rather than going in to say, you're late, that's rude, I don't like it. Because if you go that direction, you've derailed the conversation before it can happen. Then that person goes into flight or fight mode, and then you drain all the logic from their brain. They're not able to have a reasonable conversation anyway. So even if you're really angry or disappointed with someone, you check that and you come in and you establish safety. So your 3 steps to have this conversation start with safety. How do we do that? It's interesting, if you've worked with people long enough, some people want to tell you absolutely everything about things you don't need to know about. Other people, it's like you need a can opener to get into their mouth, to get any information out of it, because they're just buttoned up tight and they're not going to share anything with you. You have to make a safe place. And once the environment is safe, people are generally going to tell you, I'll tell you what you need to know. They're not going to be as defensive about how they would be otherwise. So you want to begin by stating the facts of the behavior that was contrary to the agreed expectations. Maintain safety by establishing a sense of mutual respect. That's your fill in. And by showing them that you care about their goals as well as yours. So any of you in the room that have worked with youth, respect is a big thing. I mean, it's a big thing with all people, but you'll see that youth will just kind of have this behavior that's all over the place. And then as you're trying to teach them how to have these social skills, usually the first place they go is, well, I'm not going to respect you if you don't respect me. It's this silly dialogue that you get into. And I think people just kind of carry that with them, and they feel like that person's disrespecting me because of the story, the mental story that they're telling in their head. We've always got something going on here that people have no idea what's happening in our head. So you have to be responsible, and you also have to be cautious, because you've had time as leading the conversation to mentally prepare, but you have to be aware and willing to, let that person breathe a little bit. You're establishing safety. Let them know this is a respectful meeting. We're going to have respectful dialogue because we know we're moving in the same direction. We have similar shared goals. So you want to use language that's going to be safe. You don't want to be pointing out that you said you were going to do this. We agreed. Remember when you signed your job description? We agreed 9 o'clock is your start time. Rather than you said you'd be here and you're not. You failed. Then end of discussion. You want to share your path. So you want to make sure that you're letting that person know, and this is what I observed. So after sharing the facts, you can start by sharing your story, and you show the other person how their misbehavior has affected you. At the same time, you keep looking out for threats. So if I say to that person, you said you'd be here at 9, we agreed, you've come in late, this is now impacting our relationship. If that person has a gross, strong emotional response, the safety that you thought you just created has left the conversation. Rather than pushing through the conversation, you have to stop and reestablish safety. So you can do that in different ways. Knowing who you're talking to, knowing your people is key to that. Because if I want to reestablish safety with Brittany in a way that works for Brittany, I need to know, all right, I see that I see that you're feeling defensive, but let's back up, because I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation to this. You have a sound mind. You make great decisions. I'm sure that something impacted your ability to be here on time. That might not work with a different member of your team. You might have to use a different example to get them back into feeling like we're safe. So whatever those words are that you need to use to remind them that this is mutually respectful and we have a shared goal in what we're doing. Okay. Every time a sidetrack happens, whether that be another new problem or an explosive emotion, be flexible enough either to deal with the emergent problem or to leave a bookmark at the original problem for another time. So if we're talking about this person is chronically late, I sit down to address it. They have this big explosion. You just hate me. You like everybody else, but you hate me. We're not talking about being on time anymore. So you have to stop, reestablish safety, and dig a little bit deeper, deal with that problem, and then go back to. So you bookmark. We have to bookmark that and get you back to being on time. We'll make a plan to make that happen. But you, as the leader of the conversation, have to be able to navigate that. So if somebody says that to you, you can't just say, cut it out. We're talking about you being on time. You can't be that hyper-focused. You have to be flexible enough to identify what's happening and address it, diffuse it, and move forward. So after you've shared that piece of information with them, you have to finish that part of the conversation with a question. So you share everything, and then you ask a diagnostic question like, what happened? Or can you help me figure this out? You don't say something harsh like, what's wrong with you? That's not going to continue that environment of safety if you come out with a question like that. So you want to go think about, okay, is this a motivation problem or capacity? So we want to make motivating an easy thing. So if you go to Sam in this next example and you say, Sam did not complete a quality check at work. You're now ready to go in there, have this conversation. You identify this gap with Sam. His response is going to help you determine, is this a motivation problem? Is this a capacity problem? So how Sam responds, which is your next fill-in, to your description of the gap will determine your next move. So if he says something like, what's the big deal? It's just a stupid check anyway. That's a motivation problem. Motivation is your fill-in. And I would just take a minute to pause here and tell you, when you have these conversations, make sure you're documenting these. Wherever you work, you should have some sort of process for documenting these kinds of conversations. Because if it's not the one and only time that you have it, you're going to need to go back and make sure that you have documented your objective conversation. It helps with that accountability piece. If Sam instead says, I don't really know how to do that procedure that you asked for, then you have a problem with ability. So it's up to you as the employer. Did I train you properly? Did I misunderstand your qualifications? But you want to keep that friendly tone to it. The goal is you want to help that person stay accountable and be compliant. So you want to look at how you could address either of those problems. If it's a problem with motivation, then you have to make it motivating. And just like we talked about with, establishing safety, how that might look different for people, you have to know, how am I going to make this motivation happen for this person? If you go to that place that I'm the boss and I say so, it's just not a way to develop and grow your people. You're not going to keep them in a place of motivation. They might complete that task, but you're probably going to have that conversation again. So you want to make it motivating for them in a way that you can use a natural motivator. Natural as you fill in, by showing, what kind of consequences happen. So when you're chronically late and then nobody wants to talk to you at lunchtime because they're irritated with you, there's a natural motivator. I'm having trouble building relationships because my behavior. You want to look at linking the person's core values. So the book uses the example, if you're addressing your spouse's unhealthy eating, even after 2 bypass surgeries, instead of nagging or attacking, then you might want to go into that core value solution and say, I'm worried that if your eating habits don't change, you won't raise our children, I will. Do you have the same concern? What do you think? And you just go to it at a different way. So you're going to have the end result of accountability, but nagging and saying, I don't like this, doesn't bring you through that process of holding someone accountable. Number 2, you want to connect short-term benefits with long-term pain. Show how the short-term enjoyment the person is currently experiencing is connected to longer-term problems. So that would be an example of, I'm sure it's a hassle to double-check appointments when you enter them on my calendar, but our current error rate is so high that the assistants of the other vice presidents are calling me to ask for confirmation. I worry that your reputation here is going to be hurt if we can't solve this. So you connect it to, this is not just about us or a minor infraction. This is about what's happening is impacting on a greater level. Number 3, you want to place the focus on long-term benefits. So to help people stay on course, don't look at the short term. You want to look at what's the long-term benefit that we're going to get out of something. So they use the example of parents. A lot of parents get a little irritated with their kids' tidiness or lack thereof. But if it's impacting the relationship, it can turn into something like, I know that putting up with some of the kids' messiness is really hard for you. I also believe that your relationship with them is at risk if you can't learn to let some of the smaller things go. So the skill set of holding people accountable, super effective at home, super effective at work. It's really about any relationship that you're working on. Then you want at number 4, introduce the hidden victims. We don't really like the word victim in our in our dynamic of Christianity because we overcome everything. But you have to, if people are not holding their promises of what they're supposed to be doing, you do have to point out that there is a unintended, which is your next fill-in, and often invisible effects of an action that it's having on others. So you want to point out, basically, if you're not doing this, here's what failure to comply with this, how it impacts our staff, our employees, our customer, and bring those connections together. Because a lot of times when people are underperforming, there might be a whole host of reasons, but they don't often connect how that's impacting that bigger picture. Number 5, hold up a mirror. Again, if you've got someone who's not doing what they're supposed to do, and you don't know the dialogue that's going on in their mind, they might be 100% unaware of how they're coming across to anybody else. So you want to describe how the person's action is being viewed, that you fill in, by others. And you can say that by something like, it's starting to look like you don't care about the team's results when your team has a major project due, but you drop everything and leave at 5 every day. So it's connecting that, this is impacting the entire team. When making a behavioral change motivating, match the methods, that's your next fill in, to circumstances. When people simply want to know, explain what needs to be done and why. When dealing with someone who's resist the temptation to jump to power. Instead, search for those consequences that matter to that person. So if you power over is always a solution, it's just not really always the most effective solution because you're not building the relationship, you're hurting the relationship. You have to know if this person, I used to have somebody on my team who literally would do anything for Kit Kat bar, anything. So if I needed one person to stay 30 minutes late after 7.5 hours of screaming, children, I knew who I could go to and say, if I run out and get you a Kit Kat bar, would you please just please stay, rather than looking at the whole, just take one for the team. Sometimes we have to work late. Sometimes, it was just figuring out who's motivated by what, making it happen. After you do that, of course, you go back and then give in all that fill in. Thank you. You really helped out the team. I appreciate you staying. So you know how to motivate, but you give that feedback as well. So if it's a problem with ability, then you have to make it easy. Sometimes in leadership, we do a weird thing, especially when we're new and coming up, that you take a new position and you think, oh, okay, the tables have turned. I'm now teaching others. I'm leading others. Weird things happen in people's heads. And sometimes people connect their position of authority with how hard they make things for other people. That's not healthy and it's not right, but it happens a lot. I've lived under that. Because I lived under that, did not want to be a leader that way. But it's a lack of training. It's a lack of understanding of how to really cultivate positive working relationships. So as the person in charge, it's always in your back pocket, but it's not what I would suggest. You want to look at, how can I make this easy for you? If you're struggling, like in daycare, New York State, if you've ever had to do anything that's state-driven for compliance purposes, you probably had to fill out lots of paperwork. You had to answer questions that didn't make sense. In the childcare world, the regulations are, I think it's a book about that tall, very, very just convoluted. Some of them are black and white. Most of them are gray. It's really difficult to navigate. So there might be, under all these subsets of the standards that we had to comply with, all of these different things that we had to check through the course of a 7.5-hour day. So what I found was, making sure that we were compliant. It's really hard to have hands-on care and make sure you're checking all these things all day long. So we looked at how can we streamline all of these things instead of 20 pages of things that you have to check off. Yes, I did this. Let's dial this down because the intent of this regulation is the same as that one. So we can hit both of these in one checkbox, and do something easier, make it easier for people. And then they appreciate, oh, you care about what I'm doing. You care about me, and you care that you can simplify this for me. It makes people more motivated to do what it is that you're asking them to do. There's no shame in, saying, there's an easier way to do that. Don't make it harder than it has to be. It doesn't take the credibility away from whatever your job is. It just simplifies it. So under the make it easy, resourceful people realize that when others are dealing with an ability barrier, ability as you fill in, they can either tell them outright what to do or invite them to help come up with a solution. The solution is the next fill in. So sometimes as leaders, we want to hop in and just fix the problem. Sometimes you have to do that because you're under time constraints and it makes sense. But depending on who you're trying to bring through and make sure that people are staying accountable to what they said they were going to do, there's times when you're going to have to pull them aside and say, oh, you're having trouble with this. Well, let's figure out a solution. You already know, but if you just always hand it off, then that person might not be so motivated to solve the next problem that they run into. So you want to sit with them and have that conversation. Tell me the problem. How can I help you? How can we find solution together? And then they build their skill set. And then you develop some trust over time that, oh, I can solve this on my own before I bring it to my supervisor. So you've had your accountability discussion, and you want to have, you're going into, you've talked about what it is, you've talked about the impact that this inability to perform is having on the organization and the stakeholders. You now know if you have an ability problem or a motivation problem. What you have to do is bring it all together. That part of the discussion is over, but before you leave each other, you have to have a plan in place that is mutually agreed upon. So you don't come in with a pre-filled plan and say, here, I need you to sign this. That defeats the whole purpose. You have to sit together, go through all of this, and then have a plan that designates what your next fill-in is planned by being specific about what comes next. So you can't say, I need you to do your reports on time. That's an expectation, but that's not a plan. You can't say, I need you to be here on time. That's an expectation, but if someone who's come in chronically late, you're going to have to build that plan completely different because the expectation has been there the whole time and they're clearly not meeting it. So you want to look at this acronym WWWF. So you want to know who does what, by when, and follow up. If any pieces of that plan are left out, you cannot go back and hold that person accountable because it was your mistake to not identify those things. You have to take the lead on spelling this out. So research shows most supervisors don't follow up. And again, the research that this team does is really incredible. If you get into the book and see all of the different places they go, all the different teams they've encountered, it's kind of crazy how people think. And most supervisors won't follow up because they want to appear nice. That's your next fill in. And it's really just not nice to leave people hanging, and to accept the fact that they're not being accountable hurts the whole team. So you have two forms of follow-up. You have a check-up, which is your next fill-in, and you have a check-back. So the check-up is done when you're giving the assignment and you're kind of nervous about, is this person going to be able to do what I've asked them to do? You want to look at the history. Is this person failed to follow through multiple times, or is just it's like kind of a minor thing? So you maintain control in the checkup. You take the lead, which is your next fill-in. You get your calendar out and you say something like, since this is such an important task, I'm wondering if we can meet next Wednesday at 10 to review how it's going. You write it down, you're in charge of the follow-up. That's one way. Or you could use the check back. And that you do when the task is routine, that's your fill-in, and has been assigned to someone who is experienced and reliable is your next fill-in. So you can have someone who's experienced and reliable who still failed to stay accountable, but you have that history. So you have the accountability discussion, but for the most part, this person has been following through with things. You want to give some of that control back on their plate. That's something where that person takes the lead on checking back with you. They offer suggestions on when to meet, and of course, you make yourself available. So a key to your check up and check back before you actually leave with that person, you have your plan in place. You have to take the lead on staying focused and flexible. How do I stay flexible when we're very strict about what this plan is? We know with everything that we know, we can make a plan today that we say next Thursday at 10 o'clock is what we're doing. Well, between now and next Thursday at 10 o'clock, somebody could die, somebody could get sick, somebody, their dog had puppies, whatever it might be. There's always something that changes the course of somebody being able to follow through. So what has happened, what these researchers found was that when that comes up, people usually just stay quiet about it. So they think it's acceptable. Well, I had to go to so-and-so's funeral, so I didn't get that project done. The drop-off was they never went back to their supervisor and said, hey, that plan that we have to change the date, or I'm not going to be here then. Can we pass this to another person on the team? You have to be able to make sure before that person leaves the table of your accountability discussion that you put your plan in place, and then you say to them, if something comes up, let me know. Because one of the greatest excuses that people had for not doing what they were supposed to do, they would say, oh, something came up, but then they didn't fill in the blank of what the something was. So you want to let them know, if something comes up, let me know as soon as possible. And you have to coach that person on being able to share some specific details, what came up. I don't need to know if grandma had the flu, but if grandma's sick, just let me know. Because people will do things like, oh, let's see, my kid's basketball game is here and I have to get groceries then. Whoops, I missed my deadline. And they'll say something came up, but that's not an acceptable something. So they have to report to you so that you can determine, is this something that we can rearrange? Is this something that I can excuse you from? But that's not on them, it's on you. And people need to be trained. Because again, the mental dialogue in our head goes to that place of, if I'm going to let somebody down, I have to come up with a really, really good reason why I let them down. And it's the only way we can ever make peace with, I let them down. So it's always more respectable to just be honest. But as we're growing up through the ranks of maturity, that's not usually the first place we go. And you want to be that leader and that supervisor that teaches someone, hey, you made a mistake. That's fine. I understand, but I need you to be honest with me, and I need to look at how maybe we can prevent that in the future. So you want to work with people. So as the leader, as other issues that you fill in come up, you must decide to either stay with the original infraction or change the conversation to a new issue, deal with the more pressing issue without getting sidetracked. So again, if we don't want people to get sidetracked, we control that. We control that by saying, if something comes up, let me know. Don't let me know 3 days from now. Let me know in the minute, because we have immediate communication. I don't know anyone who doesn't have text, email, phone call, whatever it might be. You might have an office right next to each other, but you have to let them know it's unacceptable to not communicate with me somehow. Give them that information. One of the keys that I wanted to make sure we talked about, we get through these fill-ins. When you're doing these kinds of exercises where you're holding these accountability conversations, making sure people's emotions are not way offline, you have to recognize I have control of me and only me. I need to make sure that I'm all right mentally. My emotions are under control. You really have to make sure that that other person, you're teaching that person. People are not coming in emotionally whole most of the time. And no shameless plug, but I have to, because our senior pastor, Pastor Rhonda, this book is something that if you have not read this and got yourself in control and you're trying to do this, it's probably going to be a lot more painful and a lot more awkward. It's awkward enough to have these conversations, no matter how much you practice. But then you have to remember, okay, I had the luxury of time to prepare myself. Who has probably not done this, and they've probably not practiced this. So be gracious about that. You know, when people respond, you cannot take it personally, because if you see a wounded animal backed into a corner, you go pet it, wonder why it bit you, you're missing something, you know. And it's kind of the same way with people. It's the same way with people who come in emotionally wounded. They might look all packaged up, nice, neat, and tidy, and you think, oh, this person is, you know, perfectly stable. The first time they fail to meet one of your expectations, you will have a very clear picture of where that level of stability really lies. So you have to be gracious about it. You have to make sure, as you're having the conversation, I'm doing this because I value you as part of my team. If I didn't care about you, I wouldn't care about having this conversation. I want to bring you to a point where you're able to, you know, trust the environment, trust the relationship, because then you'll get the most out of your people. So you absolutely have to maintain that control, because when it's kind of like with the animal that bites, when they're backed into the corner, when somebody bites at you, that's not permission to lose it and say, oh yeah, you have to keep that level of everything that you've already prepared for and say, I can see that you're angry. I can see that you're defensive. I'm not here to attack you. We're here to, you know, solve this problem together. And that will immediately start to bring some of that defensiveness down. But when someone's in that mode, and again, if they're in fight or flight, there's a biochemical reaction. You have to give them a little time to settle back down, because there's no logic in fight or flight. That's when people lift cars off of bodies, right, to save people. There's no logic in that, or nobody would ever lift the car off that body to save them. It's the same thing if you're sitting across a table with someone. If they're in that mode, give them time to readjust and then continue on. What you don't do if somebody starts to crumble and they're crying because, oh, I got caught, or I feel stupid, or, you know, I let you down, or, you know, getting defensive, you don't just say, oh, I'm not, yeah, this wasn't worth it, I'm not doing this, and walk away from it. You can't do that, because the whole point is we need to keep people accountable. But you can identify it and say, here, let me get you a tissue. Do you need some water? And, you know, be kind, be compassionate, but stay on track with what you need to do. The other thing I want to make sure I mention, when you're doing something and trying out a new skill, developing a skill, you really can't look through this and pick one thing and say, maybe I'll try that sometime, and expect to be successful with it. You have to do the whole thing. If you're going to get into this book, go through the whole book. Get the workbook, do the whole thing. If you're, you know, if you want to do this, you have to start with this, because if you can't talk to people, you can't sit down and have that conversation with accountability. So it's really a shift in the way that you do something. And I think, what is the data on establishing a new habit? Something like 21 days. Right. So you don't go in and have a failed conversation and say, oh, that's really not for me. No, that means you didn't execute it well, because you're human. You know, it's okay. So then try again. But you have to make the decision. I want to foster an environment where my people feel safe and healthy, and we're accountable. And if I don't take the lead on that, I can't expect, you know, what are you going to do? I don't like the way that person behaves. Well, if I created the monster and I did nothing about it, that's on me. So, you know, you really have to recognize when that's happening in the space, it's a leadership responsibility. Decide to do it and stick with it. And it's okay to say, that conversation didn't really go the way I planned. This is how I wanted that to go. If you don't execute something well and then you pretend like it never happened, it's really awkward and uncomfortable. So it's okay, because we're all human. Just say what it is that didn't go well, regain your footing, and keep on going. You don't dwell on it, but you keep moving forward. Does anyone have experiences they'd like to share? Anyone have any questions? Anyone have a great example of how they've tried this before, or maybe recognized I should have, and what happened as a result of that? Yes.
One thing I struggle with is like actually having the crucial conversations. Not because I'm fearful of the outcome, but I just don't feel like dealing with it. It's annoying or whatever. whatever.
Right. So the statement is, it's hard to have a crucial conversation because I kind of don't want to do it and it's annoying. And I appreciate that level of honesty because that's really why it's why we let people cut in line at the movie theater. It's why the doctor comes in and breaks protocol and doesn't use hand sanitizer before they do an examination. You have to change your mental math. You have to say, all right, if I fail to have this conversation, what is the end result? It equals a strained relationship. It equals I can't get to the end result of that task. And then once you decide I have to change the result, I would challenge you outside of your work environment. Put yourself in situations where you have to do something that you don't want to do. Because if you can build your tolerance outside of the times you have to have these conversations, you'll be able to bring that same like gut-wrenching, ugh, I don't like this, into that moment, and you'll be a little bit more rehearsed at being uncomfortable. Because really the issue is not that we don't want to resolve the problem. The issue is we don't want to be uncomfortable. We don't want to be viewed in a negative light. Once you do this successfully, that person will say, oh, that was really positive. But you don't get that happy place until you've done all that yucky stuff first. So practice being uncomfortable, practice doing things you don't like. And it is easier then to go to that mental place of, I have to do something I don't want to do. Does that make sense? Pastor Obi.
I think one of the main points that you touched on that I really did appreciate is that as difficult as it is when we may not want to have that, especially when we know that person's reaction is going to be less than positive, I think something that we have to continually keep in mind, which you touched on, is I am more concerned about the long-term than the short-term feeling. Because just like in the spiritual world, if we see somebody that is floundering and they're drowning spiritually, and we say nothing,
right,
we're doing them a disservice.
Right.
The same way from a professional standpoint, I do you a disservice if I keep quiet when I could speak up. And I think that's something that we have to just get to the point where, as painful as it is up front, even if they get upset with me, if they cut me off, if they talk back about me, whatever that may be, the long term is more impactful because I can then move forward with a clear peace of mind and saying, I did all that I could, as opposed to crap hitting the fan and saying, oh, I should have spoke up. Because I'm sure every single scientist that thought about that O-ring has to live every day on their mind that I could have prevented the death of several people.
Right.
We don't want to have that consciousness in our lives.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And as Christians, we know that we're born with selfish motives. We know that we have to surrender that. When you're in an organization, whether people know that or not, they still kind of go to what they just naturally do. And it's connecting it to the end result. What is the mission of why we're here? And if what you're doing is in the way of us reaching that mission, it's not about you as a person. It's about our behavior that we're blocking the fulfillment of that mission. That's a really great point. Anybody else have any questions or stories to share? If not, all right. I do want to mention next week, I believe, is
2 weeks.
Oh, 2 weeks. In 2 weeks will be our meal together after this training. So again, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for being present today, and we'll see you next week.